The first thing I heard when my boots hit the tarmac wasn't applause or a welcome home speech. It was the wind. Dry, sharp, rattling the chain link fence along the edge of the airfield, carrying dust that stung my eyes and tasted like metal. I remember thinking how quiet it felt after months of engines, shouting, radios crackling at all hours. Quiet can be comforting, but that day it felt wrong, like the pause before something breaks. I didn't know yet that my land was already gone. I didn't know that while I was deployed, while I was sleeping on a cot and counting the days by how many times the sun burned and disappeared, a group of people in pressed shirts and clean hands had decided my absence was an opportunity. I didn't know they'd sat around a polished conference table, passed around copies of my grandfather's deed like it was an inconvenience, and voted to erase me. I would find out soon enough. The drive home took 3 hours. I rolled the windows down even though the air was hot because I needed to feel something familiar. Sagebrush, asphalt baking in the sun, the low hum of tires on a county road that hadn't been repaved since I was a kid. I stopped at the same gas station my dad used to stop at, the one with the flickering sign and the coffee that always tasted faintly burnt. The clerk recognized me. She said, "Welcome back," with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That should have been my first clue. My family's land sat just outside a fast-growing town that liked to call itself up and coming. 200 acres my grandfather bought after the war, paid for in cash earned fixing tractors and fences for neighbors who didn't have much themselves. He used to say land was the only thing nobody could take from you if you treated it right. My father believed that. I believed that. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We grew hay, leased grazing rights, fixed what broke instead of replacing it. When my dad passed, the land passed to me, clean and simple, recorded and taxed and never once disputed. Until the HOA showed up. They came years ago before my deployment when the town started pushing outward. A developer bought the parcel next to mine and slapped together a gated community with a name that sounded expensive. They formed a homeowners association almost overnight, and with it came rules, committees, and people who suddenly believed proximity gave them power. At first it was complaints, dust from my gravel road, the sound of my old tractor early in the morning, the sight of cattle near their white fences. I ignored them. The land had seen worse than a few angry emails. Then I got orders. Deployment isn't dramatic most days. It's waiting. It's routine. It's learning to live inside a narrow slice of time and space and trusting that the world you left will still be there when you come back. I left my land locked, taxes paid, documents stored in a fireproof box in my sister's basement. I gave my neighbor permission to keep an eye on things, to call me if anything looked off. He tried, but you can't outrun paperwork with good intentions. I turned off the highway and took the dirt road that led to my property, or what used to be my property. The sun was low now, casting long shadows. I expected to see the familiar line of cottonwoods, the sagging gate, the old barn leaning a little more every year but still standing. Instead, I saw rooftops, perfect rows of them. Gray and beige and tan laid out like a model set someone had dropped onto my memory. I slowed the truck until it was barely moving. There were streets where my fields had been, sidewalks cutting through the path I used to walk with my dad, a roundabout right where the creek bent and widened in the spring. I pulled over and shut off the engine. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by distant lawn mowers and the hollow echo of kids laughing somewhere they had no idea they didn't belong. I got out and walked. There was a sign near the entrance, polished metal and stone. The name of the development gleamed in the fading light. Beneath it, smaller letters welcomed residents and reminded them of community standards. My chest felt tight, like I'd been running hard and forgot how to breathe. I walked up to the sign and touched it. Cold, solid, real. Someone had built a neighborhood on my land. I went back to my truck and sat there until the sky turned purple and then black. I don't remember how long. I do remember the smell of dust and cut grass and the way my hands shook when I finally started the engine again. That night I slept on my sister's couch. She tried to explain between apologies, but I told her not yet. I needed to see the papers. I needed facts, not panic. Here's something most people don't know. Land doesn't just disappear legally. It has to move through channels. Deeds get recorded. Notices get filed. Someone signs something somewhere. Even theft wears a suit. The next morning I went to the county recorder's office. The building smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. The clerk pulled up the records while I stood there, my uniform still creased, my boots leaving dust on the tile. She frowned as she scrolled. "That's odd," she said. She turned the screen so I could see it. According to the county, my land had been sold years ago while I was overseas. Sold for back taxes I'd never missed. Sold after notices I'd never received. Sold to a shell company that no longer existed, then transferred to the developer, then parceled out to individual homeowners. My name wasn't there anymore. I felt a flicker of doubt then. A small, dangerous voice that said maybe I missed something. Maybe deployment messed with my memory. Maybe there was a letter I forgot. That doubt lasted about 5 seconds until I asked for copies. The notices were mailed to an address I'd never lived at. The signatures weren't mine. The timeline didn't make sense. The clerk looked at me differently after that. She lowered her voice and said I should talk to a lawyer. She said it like advice and warning at the same time. I did better than that. I went home and opened the fireproof box. Inside were my grandfather's original deed, my father's will, my tax receipts, my deployment orders. Paper doesn't lie if you read it carefully. I spread everything out on the dining table, the smell of old ink and dust filling the room, and started lining dates up like dominoes. That's when I saw the pattern. While I was deployed, the HOA had petitioned the county to reclassify my land as abandoned. They claimed it was neglected, that it posed a hazard to their community. They used photos taken from carefully chosen angles. They cited ordinances passed quietly the year before, ordinances I'd never been notified about because my mailing address had been changed in the system. Not by me. The developer's shell company had paid the back taxes in a single lump sum, then claimed ownership through a process designed for properties with no heirs, no owners, no defenders. It was clean on paper, almost elegant, almost. I drove to the HOA office that afternoon. It sat in a converted model home, all glass and stone and curated smiles. The woman at the front desk asked how she could help me. I told her my name. I watched recognition flicker, then vanish behind practiced politeness. She said I should make an appointment. I said I'd wait. An hour later, the HOA president came out. He wore a blazer that didn't quite fit and a smile that leaned toward smug. He spoke slowly, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. He told me the land issue had been resolved. He told me the community had acted in good faith. He told me I should be proud of the growth I'd helped enable. I asked him how he slept at night. His smile tightened. He told me if I had a problem, I could take it up with their attorney. He slid a card across the desk, thick paper, embossed letters. As I left, I heard him make a joke to the receptionist about squatters and coming home late to the party. That's when the anger hit. Not hot and wild, but cold and heavy, the kind that settles in your bones and waits. The pressure started almost immediately. Letters from lawyers warning me not to trespass, calls from realtors asking if I wanted to cash out what little leverage I had left. A notice slipped under my sister's door reminding us of zoning violations on a property we no longer owned. Someone posted online that I was trying to scam hardworking families out of their homes. I stopped answering calls. Instead, I started digging. At night, I sat with a pot of coffee and read statutes most people never look at. Property law, military protections, obscure clauses written decades ago to prevent exactly this kind of thing. Here's something else most people don't know. When you're deployed, certain legal clocks stop ticking. Notices don't count the same way. Sales can be frozen, but only if you know where to point. I visited the county archives and asked for records older than the digital system. The archivist wheeled out boxes that smelled like mold and history. Inside, I found maps, easements, notes scribbled in margins. One document made my heart pound so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. It was an easement my grandfather had negotiated, granting him perpetual access and control over the main utility corridor that now ran beneath the new development. Water, sewer, power, control that had never been extinguished. I sat there, hands shaking, dust clinging to my sleeves, and realized something important. They hadn't just taken my land. They debuilt their entire neighborhood on top of it without truly owning the ground beneath their feet. And for the first time since I came home, I smiled. That night, as rain started tapping against the windows and thunder rolled low in the distance, I laid everything out on the table again. Papers, maps, photos. The HOA thought this was over. They thought I was tired, outmatched, alone. They had no idea what I'd just found. I didn't sleep much after that. The rain kept coming in waves, drumming on the roof like a reminder that time doesn't stop just because you're exhausted. Every few minutes I'd sit up, reach for the folder on the table, and make sure it was still there. Maps, deeds, statutes, my deployment orders clipped neatly to the front like a quiet accusation. The coffee went cold, then bitter, then I poured another cup and didn't taste it at all. Morning brought a thin fog that hugged the ground, softening the edges of everything. I took that as a sign to slow down. Anger wants speed. Strategy wants patience. The first thing I did was call a lawyer who specialized in property disputes involving service members. I didn't tell him everything on the phone. I didn't need to. I told him my land was sold while I was deployed and that an HOA was involved. There was a pause on the line long enough for me to hear his pen stop scratching. "Come in," he said. "Bring everything." His office smelled like old books and fresh toner. He listened without interrupting, flipping through my papers with a care that felt almost reverent. When he reached the easement document, his eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "This," he said softly, tapping the page, "changes things." We talked for hours. About the Service Members Civil Relief Act and how it freezes certain actions while you're deployed. About due process and notice requirements that can't be sidestepped by clerical tricks. About easements that run with the land and don't vanish just because someone pretends they didn't see them. He warned me it wouldn't be fast. He warned me it would get ugly. He warned me that the people living in those houses were going to panic. I told him I knew. On the drive home, the fog lifted and the sun came out hard and bright. I drove past the development again, slower this time. Kids were waiting for a bus. A man in running shoes waved to a neighbor. The smell of fertilizer and fresh mulch hung in the air. These weren't villains, they were collateral. That thought sat heavy in my chest, and for a moment doubt crept back in. Was I really about to upend hundreds of lives? Then I remembered the HOA president's smile, the forged signatures, the jokes about squatters, and the doubt hardened into resolve. The harassment escalated once word got around that I'd hired counsel. A cease and desist letter arrived by certified mail, warning me not to interfere with community operations. Someone filed a complaint about my sister's car being parked on the street too long. A blogger wrote a piece framing me as a bitter veteran trying to exploit legal loopholes. My phone buzzed constantly with numbers I didn't recognize. I kept my head down. Here's something most people don't know. Paper trails have shadows. For every official record, there's a set of drafts, emails, meeting minutes that never make it to the public file. My lawyer filed a discovery request broad enough to make the HOA's attorney sputter. Suddenly, we were getting documents they assumed no one would ever read closely. I read every word. There were emails discussing expediting the tax sale because owner is overseas indefinitely. There were meeting minutes noting that notices had been returned undelivered but recommending to proceed regardless. There was a memo from the developer's consultant outlining the risk of unresolved easements and suggesting they be ignored unless raised. Ignored unless raised. I raised them. We filed our first motion with the county, challenging the validity of the tax sale under military protection statutes. The county responded with a bland letter acknowledging receipt. The HOA responded with fury. Their attorney called mine, then called me directly despite being told not to. He left a voicemail full of thinly veiled threats about countersuits and legal fees. I saved it. At the same time, I started reaching out quietly to the homeowners, not all of them, just a few. I knocked on doors in the early evening when the light was soft and people were tired enough to listen. I introduced myself. I told them I'd been deployed when the land was sold. I showed them the original deed. I showed them the easement map. Some slammed the door, some told me to talk to the HOA. But a few invited me in, offered coffee, asked questions in low voices. They'd had issues too. Sudden fee increases, rules changing without votes, threats of liens for minor violations. One woman said she'd asked for copies of the HOA's contracts and been told they were confidential. Confidential to whom? As weeks passed, the pressure started to crack. The county scheduled a hearing to review the sale. The HOA blasted out emails assuring residents everything was fine. The developer released a statement about supporting veterans that didn't mention my name once. Local reporters started calling. The night before the hearing, I stood at the edge of the development and listened to the wind move through the half-grown trees. Streetlights hummed. Somewhere, a sprinkler clicked on and off, spraying water that pooled over ground that used to flood naturally in spring. I thought about my grandfather, about how he'd taught me to read land the way other people read books. He'd known about that easement because he'd planned ahead, because he never trusted promises without paper. The hearing room was packed. Folding chairs scraped the floor, people whispered, cameras whirred softly. The HOA president sat stiffly at his table, jaw clenched, his attorney leaning close to murmur advice. When my lawyer stood, the room went quiet. He laid it out calmly, the improper notices. The forged signatures, the military protections violated, the easement that made the entire development dependent on my consent for utilities. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The county attorney asked questions. The HOA's attorney objected. Documents were entered into the record. My deployment orders were projected onto a screen, the dates stark and undeniable. When the easement map came up, a ripple went through the room. People leaned forward. Someone whispered, "What does that mean?" It meant the ground had shifted. The county didn't rule that day. They recessed, promising a decision within weeks. Outside, microphones appeared. I answered a few questions, careful and measured. I said I didn't want to hurt families. I said I wanted my rights respected. I said growth didn't justify theft. That night, my lawyer called me, his voice tight with excitement. "They're scrambling," he said. "The HOA's insurer is asking questions. The developer's lender is nervous, and there's more." He told me one of the emails referenced a private meeting between the HOA board and a county official discussing how to smooth over the sale. That crossed a line. Corruption isn't always loud, but it leaves fingerprints. We filed a public records request the next morning. The fallout was immediate. The county official was placed on administrative leave. The HOA president resigned for personal reasons. The developer tried to settle, offering a check with more zeros than I'd ever seen. My lawyer slid it back across the table without touching it. "No," I said, "they don't get to buy silence." That's when the HOA made its biggest mistake. They voted in a closed meeting to cut off my access to the utility corridor, claiming emergency authority. They sent a crew out at dawn, trucks rumbling, machinery whining as they tried to install barriers and reroute lines. They thought they could move fast enough to make it a fait accompli. They forgot one thing: that easement didn't just grant access, it granted control. I got the call while I was in town. I drove straight there, the sound of diesel engines growing louder as I approached. Workers stood around, confused, blueprints spread on a truck hood. I stepped out, the dust rising around my boots, and asked who authorized the work. They pointed to a supervisor. I asked him to stop. He said he couldn't without orders. I handed him a copy of the easement and the court filing challenging the sale. He read it slowly, then called his boss. 10 minutes later, the engines shut down. The HOA president, former president, showed up red-faced and shouting. He told me I was sabotaging essential services. I told him he'd built them on stolen land. The wind carried our voices across the half-finished lawns. People came out of their houses, phones raised, whispers spreading like sparks. That afternoon, the power flickered across the development. Just for a second. Enough to make people nervous, enough to make headlines. By evening, my lawyer had filed an emergency injunction. By morning, the judge had granted it. The HOA was ordered to cease all interference and preserve the status quo until ownership was resolved. The utility corridor was locked in legal limbo, dependent on my easement. The developer's lender froze funding. Construction halted on the remaining lots. Property values dipped overnight. My phone rang constantly. Homeowners begged. The developer threatened. The HOA's attorney pleaded for a meeting. I agreed to one condition: open it to the residents. They packed the community center, the air thick with sweat and tension. I stood at the front, the hum of the fluorescent lights loud in my ears, and explained everything. Slowly, clearly. I showed them the documents. I told them I didn't want their houses. I wanted acknowledgement, restoration. A path forward that didn't involve pretending nothing happened. Some people cried. Some yelled. One man stood up and said he'd been on the HOA board and hadn't known. He looked genuinely sick. That night, as I drove away under a sky heavy with stars, my lawyer called again. "They filed a counterclaim," he said, "and they're asking the court to quiet title in their favor. If they win, your easement could be extinguished." I gripped the steering wheel, the road stretching out ahead of me, dark and uncertain. "Then we make sure they don't," I said, because I had one more document they hadn't seen yet, and it was about to change everything. The document was thinner than the rest, almost forgettable, tucked between a survey map and a faded receipt for fence wire. I'd seen it before but never really read it, not the way I read it that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table while the refrigerator hummed and the clock ticked too loud. It was an addendum my grandfather had signed decades ago, attached to the original easement. At the time, it probably felt like overkill. To me now, it felt like a lifeline. Here, as something most people don't know, easements can have teeth, not just rights of access but conditions, reversion clauses, fail-safes designed for when future owners forget the past. My grandfather had insisted on one such clause, triggered if the land served by the easement was transferred without proper notice to him or his heirs. In plain language, if someone tried to play games, control didn't just stay with the easement holder. It expanded. I read that sentence over and over, my finger tracing the ink like it might vanish if I looked away. Expanded control, including the right to approve, deny, or reclaim improvements dependent on the corridor. Reclaim. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. I felt the weight of it, because this wasn't just leverage anymore. This was a reckoning. The counterclaim hit the news the next day, framed as the HOA and developer defending homeowners against an aggressive land grab. The headline made my jaw clench. Aggressive, like forgery and quiet tax sales were passive misunderstandings. The comments were worse. People love a simple villain, and for a moment that was me. The judge scheduled a consolidated hearing. Everything on the table: title, easements, military protections, allegations of misconduct. The date loomed like a storm front. In the meantime, the harassment turned personal. Someone left a note on my sister's car telling me to go back where you came from. Another email suggested accidents happen to people who don't know when to quit. My lawyer reported it. I documented everything, paper over fists, always. I started spending my days back on the land's edge, walking the perimeter that still legally existed in a kind of ghost form. Survey stakes marked lines that no longer matched reality. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood: garage doors, dogs barking, distant laughter, and tried to reconcile them with the quiet fields I remembered. Sometimes doubt came back, whispering that this was too big, too messy, that maybe a settlement really would be kinder. Then I'd open the folder and remember why kindness without justice is just surrender. Behind the scenes, things were unraveling for the HOA. Their insurer denied coverage, citing intentional acts. Board members resigned one by one. Emails surfaced showing discussions about timing notices to avoid military review. A local reporter published a piece that laid out the story without the spin. The comments shifted. Slowly. People began asking how this could have happened. At the same time, homeowners started organizing. Not against me, but against the HOA. They demanded access to records. They voted out the remaining board at a chaotic meeting that ended with shouting and tears. A temporary committee took over, one that asked me to come speak. I stood in that same community center again, the air smelling faintly of old carpet and coffee, and told them the truth. That the court could void the entire chain of sales, that their titles might be clouded. That my goal wasn't to evict families, but to unwind a theft in a way that respected everyone caught in the middle. A woman in the back raised her hand, her voice shaking. "What happens to our houses?" I took a breath. "That depends on the court," I said, "and on what we do next." The hearing day arrived gray and cold. Rain streaked the courthouse windows, blurring the world outside into smears of light. Inside, it was standing room only, reporters, residents. Lawyers in dark suits carrying boxes of documents. The judge looked tired before we even began. The HOA's attorney went first, arguing necessity, good faith, reliance. He painted a picture of a community built on reasonable assumptions, of mistakes that shouldn't undo years of development. He downplayed my deployment, suggested notices were technically sufficient. He spoke fast, confident, like volume could substitute for truth. Then my lawyer stood. He spoke slowly. He walked the judge through the timeline, pausing at key moments, letting the weight of each violation settle. He introduced the emails, the forged signatures, the misdirected notices. He explained the Service Members' Civil Relief Act in plain terms, how it exists because history taught us what happens when people in uniform are stripped of rights while they're away. When he introduced the easement addendum, the room went still. The judge leaned forward, asked for the document. Read it again. "What does this mean?" the judge asked the HOA's attorney. "In practical terms?" The attorney hesitated. "Just a beat. Enough." "It means," my lawyer said gently, "that any improvements dependent on that corridor were made at risk, and that risk was knowingly assumed." The judge called a recess. We waited in the hallway, the smell of wet coats and old stone heavy in the air. Homeowners clustered in small groups, whispering. Some looked at me with fear, others with something like hope. I stared at the floor, at a crack shaped like a crooked river, and thought about how land remembers everything even when people don't. When we went back in, the judge's voice was firm. The court found the tax sale invalid due to improper notice and violation of military protections. The subsequent transfers were voided. Title reverted. To me, there was a collective gasp. Someone cried out. The HOA's attorney sank back in his chair, but the judge wasn't finished. The court acknowledged the reliance interests of innocent homeowners and ordered a structured remedy. I was recognized as the rightful landowner. The easement was affirmed, along with its addendum. I was granted authority to negotiate use of the land and improvements, subject to oversight, to prevent unjust enrichment of the wrongdoers while protecting residents. In other words, the houses stood on my land, and I had a say. The fallout was immediate and seismic. The developer filed for bankruptcy. The HOA dissolved. The county launched an investigation into internal practices. The official who'd been on leave resigned. Headlines used words like unprecedented and cautionary tale. My phone rang nonstop. Lawyers, lenders, homeowners, everyone wanted certainty. I took a day, just one. I went out to the far edge of the property where a sliver of field still existed, untouched because it didn't fit the subdivision grid. The ground was soft from rain. I knelt and pressed my hand into the mud, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind move through the grass the way it always had. That night I made my decision. I wouldn't evict families. I wouldn't bulldoze homes out of spite. But I wouldn't let the theft stand either. We set up a land trust, an entity designed to hold the property and offer long-term ground leases to homeowners at fair rates, rates that reflected the land's value without punishing people who'd been lied to. Ownership of the structures could remain with them. The land beneath would be leased transparently. The proceeds would go first to cover damages, legal costs, and then into a fund for community infrastructure and veterans' legal aid. The developer and former HOA board members, they were excluded from any benefit. Lawsuits followed, judgments were entered, bank accounts frozen. One by one, the people who'd thought themselves untouchable faced consequences that couldn't be spun away. Not everyone accepted the offer. A handful chose to leave, selling their houses back to the trust. We converted those lots into green space, restored the creek's natural path, planted trees. Kids started playing where fences used to be. One evening, months later, I stood at the edge of the community as the sun set, the sky streaked orange and purple. The sounds were different now. Less tension, more laughter. I smelled cut grass and rain on warm pavement. A man I barely knew walked up and thanked me, said his family could finally sleep without worrying about liens and lawsuits. I nodded, unsure what to say. The doubt I'd carried for so long finally loosened its grip. Not vanished, but eased. Justice, I realized, isn't loud when it's done right. It settles. It heals in layers. But there was one more reckoning to come, because the former HOA president hadn't accepted defeat quietly, and his last move was about to drag everything back into the light. I found out about his last move the way I found out about most things by then, through a paper trail that didn't quite line up. It started with a certified letter addressed to the land trust, thick envelope, legal weight in every fold. I recognized the return address immediately. The former HOA president's attorney. New firm, different tone, same arrogance. The letter alleged fraud. According to them, I had manipulated the court, misrepresented the easement, coerced homeowners, and abused military protections to engineer a hostile takeover of private property. They demanded damages that ran into 8 figures and sought to dissolve the land trust entirely. If successful, it wouldn't just undo what we'd built. It would paint me as the villain they'd tried to make me from the start. I sat at my desk, the hum of the computer filling the room, and let the anger wash over me without acting on it. The smell of stale coffee lingered. Outside, a lawn mower droned somewhere in the distance. Normal life still happening even as someone tried to rewrite reality again. My lawyer came over that evening. We spread the letter out and went through it line by line. It was aggressive but sloppy. They'd overreached, accusing me of things that were easily disproven by dates, filings, transcripts. Still, lawsuits aren't about truth at first. They're about pressure. They're trying to scare the lenders, my lawyer said. If they can freeze financing for the trust, they can force a settlement. I nodded. I'd expected as much. What I hadn't expected was who else was named in the suit. The former county official, the developer's consultant, 2 HOA board members who'd resigned early and thought they were safe. He wasn't just lashing out. He was trying to drag everyone down with him, betting that fear would fracture the fragile peace we'd built. The news broke the next morning. Headlines screamed about new lawsuit threatens neighborhood stability. Cameras were back at the gates. Homeowners started calling again, voices tight with worry. Old doubts resurfaced, stirred up by the familiar rhythm of crisis. I called a meeting. Not a closed one, not a boardroom session. An open gathering in the park we'd just finished restoring, the grass still uneven, the young trees staked and hopeful. The sky was overcast, a low ceiling of gray that made every sound carry farther. I stood on a temporary platform and waited as people gathered, the murmur of conversation rising and falling like surf. When it was quiet, I told them everything. About the lawsuit, about the tactics, about what it could mean if we panicked and fractured. I didn't sugarcoat the risk. I didn't promise easy outcomes. I told them the truth, that the land trust only worked if people trusted it, and that trust had to be earned every day. A man near the front asked if he should sell now before things got worse. I took a breath. That's your decision, I said. No one's trapping you here, but understand this, running won't make bullies stop. It just teaches them it works. There was a long silence after that. Wind moved through the young leaves, a soft rustle. Then a woman stepped forward. She said she'd read the filings herself, that she'd seen the evidence, that she wasn't afraid anymore. Others nodded. Someone clapped, then another. The sound spread, not loud but steady. Support isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just people deciding not to be scared. The lawsuit ground forward. Depositions were scheduled. Subpoenas flew. And here's something most people don't know. When someone sues you for fraud, your own past gets put under a microscope whether you like it or not. The former HOA president's life started unraveling in public. Financial records surfaced showing kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Emails revealed coordination with the developer far beyond what he'd admitted. A quiet second mortgage on his house came to light. Pressure works both ways. During his deposition, he tried to play the victim, claimed he'd been misled by professionals, claimed he'd never intended harm. My lawyer slid an email across the table and asked him to read it aloud. The room was silent except for his voice, faltering as he reached the part where he joked about milking the deployed guy before he gets back. He stopped reading. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows in an uneven rhythm. I watched his hands shake as he set the paper down. For the first time, he looked small. The lawsuit began to collapse under its own weight. Motions to dismiss were filed. Sanctions were requested. Judge, the same one who'd seen through the original mess, didn't hide his impatience. He ordered mediation mandatory and immediate. The mediation room smelled like old carpet and lemon polish. A long table separated us, the mediator at the head like a referee. The former HOA president avoided my eyes. His attorney whispered urgently, the confidence from earlier gone. They offered a settlement, money, a public statement, a mutual release. I shook my head. "I don't want your money," I said. My voice sounded calm, even to me. "I want accountability." The mediator raised an eyebrow. "Define that." I slid a document across the table, terms we'd drafted carefully: admission of misconduct, cooperation with ongoing investigations, withdrawal of all claims, and a contribution not to me but to the Land Trust's Legal Defense Fund and a local veterans' rights clinic. The former HOA president laughed, a short, bitter sound. Then he stopped when no one joined him. His attorney asked for a break. They came back an hour later. He looked 10 years older. He signed. The settlement was approved by the court within days. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. News coverage shifted again, this time focusing on the admissions, the investigations, the broader implications for HOAs operating in gray areas of the law. State legislators started talking about reforms. Life slowly returned to something like normal. The land trust stabilized. Lenders relaxed. Homeowners settled into routines that no longer involved constant anxiety. We finished the park, added benches, restored a walking path that followed the creek's natural curve. On weekends, families picnicked there, the sound of laughter carrying over ground that had been fought over for years. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted everything gold, I walked the path alone. The air smelled of damp earth and grass. A light breeze carried the distant sound of a barbecue, someone grilling dinner, ordinary and perfect. I thought about my grandfather again, about how he'd insisted on that addendum, about how he'd taught me patience over force, about how he'd said land isn't just dirt, it's memory, responsibility, and promise. I stopped at a bench and sat, listening to the wind in the trees. For the first time since I'd come home, I felt something like peace settle in my chest. But peace, I'd learned, isn't an ending. It's a practice, and there was one last thing I needed to do before I could truly let go. The last thing wasn't legal. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve a courtroom or a headline or a document stamped by someone in authority. It was quieter than all that, and because of that, it mattered more. I waited until the park was finished. Not the ceremonial finished with ribbon and speeches, but the real kind, when the grass had taken hold and the young trees no longer needed stakes to stand straight. When the walking path had been worn smooth by footsteps instead of machines. When the creek ran where it wanted to run again, not forced into angles that looked good on brochures. It was early morning when I went out there, the kind of morning where the air still feels like it's thinking about whether to be warm or cold. Dew clung to the grass. A light fog hovered just above the ground, turning everything soft at the edges. The only sounds were birds and the distant hum of a highway reminding you the rest of the world was still moving. I carried a small wooden box under my arm. Inside it were copies of everything that had started this: my grandfather's deed, the easement, the addendum, my father's will. Originals stayed safe, but these copies had earned their place too. Alongside them was a photograph of my grandfather standing in the field, hat tipped low, a half smile on his face like he already knew something you didn't. I stopped near the bend in the creek, right where the land used to flood in the spring, where my father had taught me to stack stones to redirect water without fighting it. I knelt, the grass dampening my knees, and opened the box. For a moment, doubt surfaced again, not sharp this time, just reflective. Had I done the right thing? Had I balanced justice with mercy, strength with restraint? You don't get answers to those questions from statutes or judges. You only get them from living with the consequences. I dug a small hole with my hands. The earth was cool and smelled rich, alive. I placed the documents inside, sealed in protective sleeves, and covered them gently, not to hide them, to mark them. A reminder that paper can shape the world, but it all comes back to soil in the end. I stood and brushed the dirt from my palms. The fog was lifting now, the sun beginning to burn through. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A door opened and closed, life continuing. Later that day, I met with the trustees, ordinary people, now teachers, engineers, retirees, who'd volunteered to steward something bigger than themselves. We went over budgets, maintenance schedules, community proposals, boring, necessary work, the kind that keeps things honest. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. We talked about gardens, about adding shade near the playground, about how to teach kids where the water came from and why it mattered. That was the legacy part my grandfather never wrote down. Months passed. Then a year. The land trust became a case study in law schools. Veterans groups invited me to speak, not about revenge or victory, but about vigilance, about reading what you sign, about asking who benefits when things move too fast. I always told them the same thing. The system doesn't protect you automatically. You have to know where it bends and where it breaks. I drove past the old HOA office one afternoon, now empty, the glass dusty, the sign gone. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the parking lot. For a second, I remembered the man in the blazer, the smile, the certainty that came from thinking consequences were for other people. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just a quiet acknowledgement that power borrowed without consent always comes due. One evening, my sister called me out to her porch. The air was warm, cicadas buzzing in the trees. She handed me a cup of coffee and nodded toward the horizon where the lights of the neighborhood glowed softly. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about it, about the nights I'd lain awake listening for the next threat, about the weight that had lived between my shoulders for so long, about how light it felt now. "I am," I said, and meant it. The last official act came on an unremarkable Tuesday. A letter from the state arrived, confirming new regulations for HOAs involving absentee owners and service members. Stronger notice requirements, independent oversight, clear penalties. It wouldn't fix everything. Laws never do. But it would slow the next group of people who thought absence was consent. I walked the land again that evening, following the path as it curved through trees that were taller now, leaves whispering in the breeze. Kids rode bikes, their laughter echoing. A couple sat on a bench by the creek, feet dangling, talking about nothing important at all. I stopped where the old fence line used to be, invisible now unless you knew how to look. I closed my eyes and listened. Wind, water, footsteps on gravel, no machinery, no shouting, just the sound of something settled. Here, as something most people don't know, winning doesn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like letting go of the version of yourself that was forged in anger and choosing to keep the part that learned patience instead. Sometimes justice isn't a moment, but a process you keep showing up for even when no one's watching. I opened my eyes as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in slow-moving colors. I thought about the land, about how it had outlasted every scheme and would outlast me too. About how my grandfather had trusted the future enough to prepare for it, even when he wouldn't be there to see it. I turned and walked home, the path firm beneath my feet. They sold my land while I was deployed. They built houses where my memories lived. And in the end, I didn't burn it down or take it back with force. I reclaimed it the only way that lasts, by making sure it was never stolen again.